This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box to this episode. Patreon is a monthly subscription and you can cancel anytime. And PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. I'm Rania Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.
Nadim Shehadi, this is my third time on the Beirut Banyan.
Nadim Houry, Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative, and this will also be my third time on the podcast. Very honored. Diaspora refers to the community of Lebanese or people of Lebanese descent who live abroad. Now, like most things related to Lebanon, numbers are not always very clear. Some people talk about 6 or 8 million people of Lebanese descent. The group that I find most interesting is the Lebanese, the first generation Lebanese. And those, if you look at the literature, estimates vary between 700,000 to 1 million. So these are people who were themselves born, in Lebanon and themselves emigrated. Why is this group the one that I find most interesting, particularly in relation to the current crisis? Because they are the ones who are so far most actively involved, and involved in what I would consider in a pattern of, frequent returns and visits, and today regularly, almost daily contacts with people back in Lebanon. And they also now tend to watch Lebanese TV on their phones and so forth. So they, in a way, the physical distance that used to separate the diaspora from Lebanon has shrunk greatly.
I watch Lebanese TV when I'm abroad much more than when I'm in Beirut. And when I'm in Beirut, I ignore it totally. And here I follow it. But I think diaspora is more of a state of mind because it's not where you are physically, it's where you are mentally. You could cut off completely with Lebanon after a very short time abroad. You meet people and you think they've been here for the third generation, and you find that they've been here for 2 years. They cut themselves off. And you meet people who have been here for 3 generations, and they're very engaged, or they vary. So I think it's more of a state of mind in a sense, whether you have your mind in both places or your identity, because that's what diaspora means, is both places, or you cling to one. And I don't consider myself diaspora. I consider myself as a Ras Beiruti working abroad. I just happen to be in London or in Boston or in New York, but I'm still a Ras Beiruti.
If you take the first generation Lebanese immigrants, you'll also, I think, have different dynamics, not only across individuals, but also as groups, depending on where they live. If you think about, for instance, the Lebanese diaspora living in the Gulf countries or in West Africa, their future was almost always intimately tied to Lebanon. I mean, there was no retirement planned in the Khalij or in West Africa. They always thought of Lebanon as the place where they're going to send their children maybe for high school or university. So what's happening in Lebanon today impacts them in a very direct way. Whereas, if you're a Lebanese in Canada, maybe you had thoughts about retiring in Lebanon, but you always have a fallback plan. And these are just layers that show the complexities of the diaspora and their relationship. People always tend to think of diaspora as somehow this unitary body that's tied to the homeland. In practice, most diaspora studies show that diaspora communities are often divided as well. One particular impact on the Lebanese diaspora, and particularly because of the civil war and sort of the confessional making and the sectarian making, is when you look at the most important diasporic structures of Lebanon, most of them are along sectarian, regional, or basically confessional backgrounds. And the and the politics of the diaspora and the institutions of the diaspora have actually followed very closely the divisions in Lebanon. I mean, if I can tell you a short anecdote, which I always think is very funny, the first mosque, the first Shia mosque to open in Australia, a country with a big Lebanese diaspora, was in 1983 in Sydney. And when it opened up, it was controlled by a cleric affiliated with Harakat Amal, with the Amal movement. In the mid-1980s, the Hezbollah-backed organization called Al-Zahra wrested control of that mosque. And this was in relation to events happening in Lebanon at the time when there was actually a lot of intra-Shia fighting. I give this anecdote because, it's a far away, it's minimal, but it shows that the divisions, it's not just the divisions between Christians and Muslims, Sunnis and Shias, Maronites and Sunnis, but also the diaspora, structures that were in place have often reflected the divisions. And I think, in a way, while everyone talks about the important role of the diaspora in Lebanon, I think it is very true. I mean, just in terms of the amount of remittances, in terms of projects, they have perpetuated the sectarian power structure in Lebanon. So it's an important player. Just want to take the last decade. I mean, we can talk about history, and Nadim Shehadi here, I'm sure will has a big memory of these things. But even if I look at post-Lebanon civil war, if I look at the parliamentary elections in 2009, the municipal elections 2010, the engineering syndicate elections in 2011, in each of these instances, what did the diaspora do? Lebanese political parties paid for members of the diaspora to fly in to vote for them. And they did it. The biggest successful fundraising efforts for political movements in Lebanon and the diaspora are the traditional political parties. Of course, you have examples of non-sectarian efforts, but when you look at the numbers, they pale compared to the sectarian, confessional, and political machine. So for every dollar that the non-sectarian diaspora raises for giving to non-sectarian causes in Lebanon, you will have tens of dollars being funneled through Sunni religious institutions, Shia institutions affiliated with Amal al-Hezbollah, Christian associations. It's just the nature, of the way the diaspora has functioned until now.
And village-based associations. But there's another thing. When we talk about political parties, a lot of the political parties in Lebanon were set up by people from the diaspora. And there's a very good reason for that, because if you're in Lebanon, if you're in a way trapped in a clientelist, feudal sort of framework where there's very little potential to create a party. Whereas if you come out of the system and you become less dependent on someone for a job and for living and for business, you can see the system from outside and you come out with new ideas. So Amal was set up in a way by expats. Nabi Houry was born in Sierra Leone, used to be in Detroit. The SSNP was set up by Anton Saadi, who was in Latin America. He was in Argentina, born in Argentina. Pierre Jmeil was a pharmacist in Egypt. Raymond Eddy was in Paris, So you'll find that a lot of politicians or political ideas, new political ideas, other than the clan and the sort of very narrow sectarian definitions, were created by people who stepped out of the system and could see it and could come up with alternatives. So that's why diaspora politics is sometimes much more intense than internal politics.
No, I would definitely agree with Nadim on that point. But what's interesting is a lot of these examples are old. I mean, this is, I think, what I find fascinating. And again, that's why I think we may be at a turning point. In a way, during the Civil War and post-Civil War, the sort of existing parties in Lebanon managed to get a hold and to almost freeze diaspora evolution. So what's interesting to me is during the Civil War, there were very few prominent ideas that came out of the diaspora that challenged the entire power dynamics. It remained quite marginal. I mean, there might be examples, but they remained quite marginal. And so I think this is why I think it's very, very interesting is will we see today a weakening of the hold that the traditional political parties, which were not traditional 30 years ago but became traditional now, have on that diaspora? And I think it's a big question mark. But I think this is where the diaspora became quite conservative in Lebanon, patriarchal, and not conservative in terms of how they dress, but conservative in even its perception of Lebanon, of how they would see. And I'll give you two examples that I lived when I was in Lebanon and working on human rights issues. One is the general perception of the diaspora on the right to give nationality. So the diaspora is very much behind the right to give nationality to expat, to Lebanese born outside and so forth. But they did not support in any vocal way the right of Lebanese women in Lebanon to give citizenship to their children. When there was actually a big movement in Lebanon by women's rights organizations and human rights organizations to give that right, it was interesting. It was generally met with an overall shrug by the diaspora and definitely by the main diasporic structured groups. And again, why? Because I think each one of them was looking at their own interest. And in some of these structured groups, they were like, we care more about the rights of the Lebanese who are abroad than children of Lebanese mothers living in Lebanon. And the other example, which has always been close to my heart, frankly, is the rights of migrant domestic workers. And this is an issue that I worked on for years. And the Lebanese community, by and large, outside of Lebanon, was sort of aloof to that issue, even if they felt it was bad, even if it was sort of, sometimes embarrassing to them when they'd be in Lebanon and they see certain behavior. They never took it up. And again, you could argue that this is very common in many, many diasporas, but again, it's a diaspora that's been very patriarchal as well in terms of its views, in terms of its politics, in terms of its representation. And I'm hoping that maybe this feminist moment that we're living in Lebanon will push for a revolution within the diasporic institutions.
Is there any complication with the Lebanese diaspora, and let's use America as an example, being lumped into a wider pool, which is the Arab American community? Does that have is there any problems in terms of just the relationship and what you're describing, which is a more inward sectarian looking thing? Or is that a Lebanese issue regardless? That it has nothing to do with, let's say, the Palestinian cause, or for that matter, the Arab-Israeli conflict, or anything that could maybe put Lebanon into sort of a larger, whether it's issue or problem?
So I'm not an expert on the Lebanese diaspora in the U.S., but I don't think that's been a particular issue. I mean, again, I think it depends on which Lebanese diaspora in the U.S. you're talking about. If you're talking about the Shia in Dearborn, Michigan, and their politics,
right.
If you're talking about third-generation Lebanese in Oklahoma, if you're talking about Christians in the financial industry in New York, again, I mean, it's a very rich diaspora in terms of its rich, and I don't mean here in the material sense, but in terms of diversity of experiences. And again, for me, the lens is the divisions that have plagued the diaspora are the divisions that have plagued Lebanon. And in a way, I think Nadim Shehadi was talking about that state of mind. You're Ras Beiruti in the U.S., that has also affected. You're a southerner from Lebanon in the U.S. or in Canada. And again, this is not unique, by the way, to the Lebanese diaspora. If you look at studies of other diasporas, the Armenian diaspora, the Greek diaspora, the Irish diaspora, they've also been very divided at times. It's just maybe the divisions in the Lebanese diaspora are more pronounced because the divisions in Lebanon are in a way more pronounced.
Right.
So the way they behave in the country in the recipient country depends more on the structure of the recipient country. If you live in a melting pot, or if you live in a mosaic, or if you live in a place which doesn't accept foreigners, then where you cannot integrate, or where it's more difficult to integrate, like in Africa or in the Gulf by laws. You can never integrate. Then your relationship with the country of origin and your relationship with the country where you are is dictated by that.
That's interesting. So Carlos Hilson in Japan he cannot just be inward sort of Christian looking, that he has to, like his Lebanese identity would shift in Japan as opposed to, let's say, France, for example?
Yes, it would be. He would be different in Japan
Yeah.
than he would be in France, because
Right.
in France he can integrate. In Japan,
Right.
there's less possibility of. Although there are Lebanese in Japan who are well integrated, but there's less possibility of integration.
Interesting.
But again, don't underestimate the diaspora element in post-Civil War Lebanon. You have Hariri, Miqati, Makhzoumi, Isam Faris, all these people who came and entered politics after the, apologies for those I forgot, but there were lots of people who entered politics when they spent the war outside, and they came back with ideas to rebuild the country, very nationalist, very and of course Nasib Lahoud is a good example.
I noticed myself just coming to the States a few weeks ago that the diaspora here is still very passionate about the momentum back home. And I left, and maybe you'd share the same experience, where things were looking more pessimistic in Lebanon, at least the last few weeks, that there's still this sort of yearning abroad for Lebanon to sort of move on from its intercommunal arrangement. But what I'm getting from you is that even those aspirations are somewhat maybe temporary, that the community abroad, regardless, still has their structural sort of inward-looking behavior that you see at home, and it's going to be reflected no matter what happens. That, in other words, I mean, I don't want to be too specific here, but let's say a Maronite sort of NGO and what you said earlier, let's say a mosque is built and that kind of stuff, that you can't really get beyond those things.
So that's what I actually was, so far I've been really thinking, looking back, because I do think we are at a critical moment. I mean, Lebanon is changing.
Yes.
The mood is changing in Lebanon. I think it's going to be a long process, but things are changing and people are sort of reimagining their identity. Of course, not the entire country, but a number of people. I am very interested to see how this will be reflected in the diaspora. Because I think there is a significant number of people in the diaspora which I think are ready and will want to support sort of new Lebanese movements and identity. So I'm actually not necessarily saying the Lebanese diaspora has always been sort of conservative, followed what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, now that Lebanon is changing, I think the Lebanese diaspora is going to change a bit as well.
Yeah.
Now, the question for me is really twofold.
Yeah.
Because, again, I'm less interested in individuals and more about structures. That's how I tend to think about the... Are we going to see an effort, for instance, to take control of some of the main diaspora institutions by some of these people that are yearning now for a more, civil state in Lebanon, less sectarian, a more accountable sort of country? Are we going to see that? Or are we going to see maybe the creation of a new diaspora initiative? And already we're seeing more and more of them, which are going to come and sort of challenge the traditional hegemony of the more conservative, patriarchal, older version. I mean, if you think about your typical diaspora event in Lebanon, you'd either think about the big village dinner in the summer where they listen to Yad al-Dal'una and they drink ava and they eat or you would think about, a sort of fancy event at Biel hosted by probably Gibran Bassil, and everyone's talking about how great Lebanon is and how they're going to invest, but no one actually invests, and everyone is over the age of 60, with a couple of side events for the young ones. I mean, this is
you've been to both.
Well,
I've been to both.
I can see that.
This is
the air conditioning broke down in the Gibran Bassil event.
This is the diaspora institutionally as it was before October 17th. Is it going to change? That is the big question. Are people going to say, we don't want to listen to the same broken speeches about, love Lebanon, bring your dollars to Lebanon that you won't be able to withdraw now? I think this is really interesting. And I think, yes, we will see some initiatives, but I also don't want to minimize the existing tentacles of the Lebanese sectarian, political, regional network that already has well-established tentacles.
But what I'm getting from you at the end is that, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, that if Lebanon changes, the diaspora will change. If Lebanon stays the same, the diaspora will stay the same. That the issues begin back home in Lebanon.
I would say it's a dialectic, but I want to let Nadim Shehadi.
He said something much more interesting because it's generational, and this is what your conversation with Nimr Abu Nassar was about.
I was going to bring him up because he is the big example of
because
diaspora.
The new generation. You see, I think Lebanon changed. Changed in 2005 because the country got divided not on sectarian lines but on political lines. You were either pro-Syrian or anti-Syrian. You demonstrated either in Tahrir, in Martyr Square, or in Riyadh Salah. That was the division, and it was a division within each community. So it became the real division in Lebanon was within each family, within each community, within each village, and it's not a sectarian division, as much a sectarian division as people read in textbooks, because the real sectarian division only existed in textbooks. When you get foreign observers talking about zaims and clientelism and all that, they've read books from the 60s, and they're I don't mean anyone in particular.
No, I think you do.
we don't recognize this.
But even then, I mean, and I hope I'm getting this right, that because the Lebanese scene did not change that much after March 2005, that the diaspora was maybe unable to move beyond the issues that you're discussing, which is that sort of, at the end of the day, it did take somewhat of a sectarian tone.
What do you mean it didn't change that much?
Well, okay, let's go. I mean, going back in time a bit, the aspirations in 2005 in Lebanon, not in the diaspora, were not necessarily met.
No, but it did change.
Well, I mean, in terms of the diaspora...
But I'll give you a personal example. I mean, I was part of the Lebanese diaspora which decided to come back to Lebanon after 2005.
We actually met on his trip back on the plane.
In 2006. So I moved back in 2006 to Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I agree with Ronnie. It was a disappointment. And I left again a decade later because I felt Lebanon had not changed, and the hope and promise of 2005 of trying to build a new country that would not just overcome the usual, the sort of sectarian cliche of things, but actually overcome the sort of clientelistic network. For me, anyways, that promise was not held. And I think there are a lot of people, and I would count myself in that group, that have high hopes that maybe this time it will be different. And again, I actually see it as a gradual process. And each experience, we are all collectively and as individuals learning and building on that. Yeah. So there are lessons from 2005 that echo today. There are networks that started in 2005 of activists, of ideas that echo today. There are fears and so forth. I think we had to go through all these steps to where we are, where we are today.
Nadim Shehadi, you mentioned Nimr Abu Nassar, which I like that you said, because that is one example of many where you have somebody in the diaspora really trying hard to have a parallel conversation altogether. And he set up his own initiative.
It's not an example of many. Nimr Abu Nassar is Nimr Abu Nassar, but he's also of a generation that can use social media, that can use the internet, where you are divorced from your, it's you on the phone or on the screen. It's not you sitting in your village or in the diaspora within your tribe. Kamela, and they are, if you go to some of the diaspora community, they are more Lebanese than the Lebanese, and they cook things that we stopped cooking in Lebanon, and they speak with an accent that's more authentic than in Lebanon. the regional accents and the regional cooking are more maintained outside. But once the young people are with the screen, they are not acting as part of that group, and they're part of a global network which behaves in a much more random manner and they relate differently to each other. So I think that's a very, very important phenomenon, and it's very different from anything we've seen.
But is there something in the ability to, let's say, offer an alternative? And in a sense, he's going his own way. A democratization, and in terms of voting, you don't have to go through the Lebanese system. You go through Nimer's website. Is that the future of the diaspora? And when it comes to the Lebanese story, that there's no hope for things to improve back home, so this is an alternative.
A virtual Lebanon. You have your...
in other words, anyone abroad or even within Lebanon who's interested can participate in that kind of model. Whether it succeeds or not is a different story. But is that the difference, that maybe this time around you have an audience abroad that is, in a way, they're not stuck with the Lebanese model. They can flirt with different ideas.
I think it's very generational. The new generation are very different from my generation because of the effect of 2005. That's why maybe amnesia is such a good thing, because the enemies of yesterday are the friends of tomorrow or of today, and people you fought with in the Civil War are now your allies because of different politics. I'm thinking, Samir Jaja could win an election in Akkar today. It's as extreme as that. Whereas Samir Jaja is known as the guy who did Sabt al-Aswad against Sunnis. You see, so there's no more tension. There's no, you can't freeze sectarian tensions by saying there's a Sunni Maronite tension, because in 1975-76 there was this clash over Palestinian presence, and there was real Maronite Sunni tension, and the country was about to get cantonized and divided, and people said, okay, you can live on your own, we live on our own.
I like that you mentioned someone like Nimer, and he said, when we spoke, he said that he's, in a way, he's lucky because comedy is one of those few sort of arenas where you can have differing political ideologies or different religions, whatever you want to call it, diverse groupings showing up, watching a Lebanese performer. They're all living abroad. Everyone watching, for the most part, is either familiar with Lebanon or Lebanese, and thousands of people flock to him. And he's touring at the moment across North America. Are there other venues where Lebanese abroad have that kind of audience? Is there a political sort of mechanism where the diaspora could entertain the idea that you were describing earlier, which is the alternative?
There are interesting examples of non-sectarian diasporic meeting spaces of the Lebanese. The most obvious one tended to be university alumni. Right? They come together, they meet. It's a limited occasion. We are starting to see as well professional style groups of diaspora. If you think about life, when in the financial industry, these are workers. They have maybe what unites them is they're all quite wealthy now, but they're from different confessional sectarian groups. They were. No, but I think but what you say, it's true that you do need space. It doesn't have to be physical anymore. It can be virtual space.
Yes.
For that, new Lebanon that we're all trying to create, where the diaspora could also feed into. There was an interesting study done a few years ago on the Lebanese diaspora. I think it was in Canada and France, and how they consume websites and news. And at the time, they found that basically, the Christians were checking certain websites and the Muslims were checking different websites, and there was these divisions. If today, and we don't have the data, if they are watching and if they are reading similar things, are they reading something like Megaphone, the new online platform that's sort of generational? And does this have the same penetration rates in Australia as it does in West Africa or not? Because again, don't forget, the divisions in the diaspora were not just privilege, it was also in the media that you watched. If you're a Shia in West Africa, you're probably watching Al Manar on your TV. If you're a Christian in New York, you may be watching MTV. So I think even those replicated, but are we seeing it different? I mean, and this is an open question mark today. It's clear, are the Lebanese in the diaspora aware of all the changes in Lebanon? I just came back from Beirut now, and by seeing people, you change.
Yes.
But people are living in Lebanon is transforming them. My friends who are staying in Lebanon, they are having an accelerated political learning. The frustrations they're having every day at the banks is changing them.
Yeah.
Friends who would have never talked about politics, who proudly used to say they are apolitical, have actually become very political since October, even though they're in their 40s. And I think this will have a long-term change. The carefree sort of attitude for the diaspora, the idea, this sort of stereotype that you used to watch on the, at least airline screen, we're just there to party and a bit of banks and a bit of meza and a bit of real estate. That Lebanon is no more, and it's not coming back. Those in Lebanon are aware of that.
Yeah.
Has that sunk in to the minds of the diaspora?
And then, is there a way for the diaspora to be more involved? Given that we've seen attempts the last few months, I've met organizers in New York who were very adamant that they were going to succeed in turning Lebanon into something else. Very passionate, very enthusiastic, and I mean, you can see that there's limits to that kind of hope. And no matter what they do, they get stuck at the end with the same issue, which is Lebanon doesn't seem to change. It sort of sticks to its old ways, and it continues to decline.
Lebanon is changing. I think you're being a bit too pessimistic. It doesn't mean it's not a linear process, but I think Lebanon is.
Does the diaspora have any tools to make sure Lebanon changes for the better?
I think you're getting stuck in a bubble that I want to burst.
Burst away.
Because you're both assuming that the old ways in Lebanon are bad, and there's a new way that's coming where the Lebanese are homogeneous and
no one said homogeneous, but the old ways are bad, and I know you're a defender of the Levantine. But I want to hear you out. I want to hear you out.
We can mute his mic from here. No,
you can mute the mic. I know you can edit me out. No, in the sense that the essence of Lebanon is not homogenization or cohesiveness. It's accepting the other in the way the other is. You don't need to change you don't want the other to stop being himself. And when the other becomes too much himself, or there's a clash, you both become sectarian. But when things are in equilibrium and fine, and there's prosperity, you live together and you recognize who the other is. There's no need to pretend that religion doesn't matter and language doesn't matter and background or any or ethnicity or whatever. They matter, but they're not a big deal. Because we accept each other. It's very different from the melting pot secularist Lebanon that sometimes people aspire to, which I don't.
Can I just say something? Because I disagree with Nadim. I mean, and also again, my aspiration is not a Lebanon that is somehow a melting pot, and I don't think this is what people are proposing. I just think the old way of doing things, the Lebanon that you're describing, Nadim, hasn't existed for the last 40 years, because this Lebanon in equilibrium, if this was truly the case, we would have had a census since 1932. A country that is afraid of counting its own citizens is not a country that is at its equilibrium. A country that is ruled by hereditary rule, or where 1% of the population has 50% of the wealth, is not a country that is at peace with itself. It's a country that is an eternal project for instability and war and conflict and displacement. And I don't think, at least, I'll just speak for myself, what I hope will change in Lebanon is not that we all become the same, or somehow we will have a état laïcard, l'état laïque, the French way. Not at all. I mean, this is not even possible in Lebanon, and it's not even something that one should aspire to. But basically, a decent state that treats citizens as citizens that don't have to go through a confessional intermediary. This is the problem with the old model. No one is, if you want to remain a Maronite in terms of your identity, of course, remain that way. But my relationship with the state should not be premised on a confessional group controlling this, and that confessional group being under the control of one or two individuals, which happen to be in the majority warlords that, if you ask me, should have been prosecuted a long time ago.
Yes, but you see, what I'm referring to is are adverts that you know very well, where you had people claiming proudly, I am Kuwaiti, I am French, I am American, I'm this, and then Lebanese claiming shyly and a bit ashamed of themselves, I am Maronite, I am Sunni, I am Druze, as though it's shameful to have an identity. These were the adverts you were seeing by the so-called civil society movement that wants to change, and these are the unrealistic and undesirable ones. And as far as I'm concerned, I have friends from all different sects or ethnicities or whatever, and I recognize who they are, and we have you want to reach a situation where you know who the other is and you respect who the other is and you allow them to be themselves, and there's no problem in that.
I agree, but this is not, I fully agree with you. I think where we may disagree is identity is not static and is not based on the religious groups of your parents. I think this is the big problem. And in Lebanon, of course you can try to move along, but I think we have to move beyond that sectarian group. I mean, we've gone away from sort of the diaspora,
but it is something that the diaspora are very exercised about.
But this is what but can I ask you both? Does the diaspora have a role in terms of political reform? Remove the remittances, remove the lifeline that they've been for Lebanon, just in terms of how to cope with all that's happening and find a mechanism that suits everyone, and not what we've had the last few decades, something else. Does the diaspora have that role in at least influencing the way Lebanon evolves beyond these protests?
So time will tell. I think there are some interesting experiences. Why do I say time will tell? It's clear the diaspora is going to play an essential role in sustaining and helping Lebanon and their families back home during the current crisis. Again, this is not something new, and even if you go back to the archives during World War I and the famine of World War I, the Lebanese in the U.S. played a huge role sending remittances back. And I'll just make a plug. There's amazing research work that was done by the Khairallah Center at UNC on that. But I think what's going to be interesting, so we know the money's going to go. Will this money continue to be funneled like it is today, mostly through sectarian-based political affiliation? So it's still helping, but even with the good intentions, it just reinforces the tentacles. Or will we somehow see, in parallel, a development of, again, aid that is less funneled through the existing mechanisms? For me, this is what we need to watch. Will we start seeing, I'm going to help university students in Lebanon finish their education, and I'm not going to care whether they are from my region, whether they're from my confession, or whether they're going to my alma mater. That will be a first test. A second idea I think that's going to be very interesting to see is, we know that in Lebanon there are a lot of new political ideas emerging. We know that there are new political movements that will come out, new political leaderships that will come out from these movements. Will we see the diaspora, or part of the diaspora, because we can't talk about the diaspora as a unitary body, will we start seeing part of the diaspora financially supporting these new political movements? Or maybe will we see new political entrepreneurs emerge from the diaspora to go back to Lebanon and run in the elections? I think the answer is yes. But time will tell. But I think the answer is yes. I'm sure as we're speaking right now, there are some ambitious Lebanese, I hope some Lebanese women at this stage, sitting in Dubai, sitting in New York, sitting in Paris. I'm going to go and be the next prime minister of Lebanon, and these are my ideas. And I'm going to have a new proposition. I'm going to test my proposition in the market of ideas inside Lebanon. I surely hope so.
How do we differ? How does the Lebanese diaspora differ from the other Arab diasporas, yani Syrian, Iraqi, Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian, who have huge diasporas too in Europe, and that you are involved with?
Look, it's hard because even these diasporas are incredibly dynamic. And again, it's Arab diasporas, to the difference of the Lebanese diaspora, the other Arab diasporas have traditionally either been opposition diasporas. If you think about the Iraqi diaspora pre-2003, sort of political refugees of one, those sort of on the losing end of a bargain. So their politicization was in some ways frozen in time. And that's a big difference. I think in Lebanon, it was sort of always much more divergent. But even saying that, I'm generalizing a bit. And to the politics back home for these other Arab diasporas were always a lot more closed than what they were for the Lebanese diaspora, where there is space for political entrepreneurship. So, for instance, you don't see that many examples historically of the other Arab diasporas funding elections or funding political parties, because frankly, there were no elections in the home country. But on other aspects, they're very similar. I mean, if you look at the Tunisian diaspora, the professional networks that exist there between Tunisians, particularly in France and in Tunisia, are very similar to some of the networks that exist between the Lebanese professionals and the Lebanese. But I say that while at the same time we have to recognize that the diaspora field of studies is evolving greatly, because in all in the entire Arab region, we're seeing new diasporas emerging that are playing a different role. I mean, if you think about the Libyan diaspora, it's no longer your grandfather's Libyan diaspora. If you look at the diaspora in Europe, the big intellectual life of the Arab diaspora was in London. Today, the new young diaspora's intellectual epicenter is actually in Berlin.
Berlin, exactly.
It's also changing, so it's very hard to because we're not comparing apples to apples. So it's probably not a very satisfying answer, but to just say the one thing is clear across the board, and this is very clear. For instance, what's happening in Algeria and Sudan right now is that the physical boundaries that used to separate the home countries from the diaspora have basically disappeared across the region. And when you talk, I think, Nadim, you use this expression of people being, in their sort of where they are in their mind. And today you can find Algerians in France, Syrians in Germany, Egyptians in Germany. Their mind is back home, and they are in contact daily on WhatsApp with their home countries. And in that way, they have become very, very similar to what we see with the Lebanese diaspora.
Yeah.
It's definitely an engaged population. They're very excited, and I think everyone is still hoping that this time things will emerge for the better. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts.
They should stop hoping, and they should be helping make these changes happen.
I want to give a final word for the older diaspora, the beyond that go beyond. I've been in places like Colombia, where you have huge family gatherings, who start crying when they speak about Lebanon, and they don't even speak Arabic. And we shouldn't assume that the connection is not there. It's very emotional for them and very strong.
Nadim Houry, Nadim Shehadi, thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from you down the road. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.